Welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to help trauma therapists be their incredible selves, to be human, to be real, not just a clinician. I'm a big believer in who we are is more important than what we know. And this requires cultivating authenticity, genuineness, and vulnerability, and that requires intention. You can learn more about my courses and workshops by going to thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. Let's get started. Here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Tracey Shores. Tracey, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Awesome. So Dr. Shores is a distinguished professor in behavioral and systems neuroscience in the Department of Psychology and the Center for Collaborative Neuroscience at Rutgers University. She has about 150 scientific publications and has recently written a popular book titled Everyday Trauma. Her research program studies how our brains ruminate on trauma-related memories and how this process can interfere with our everyday lives while making still more memories. Dr. Shores is also focused on identifying effective tools for reducing repetitive thoughts that reinforce our everyday traumas. Her brain fitness program, known as MAP, that's M-A-P, Train My Brain, combines mental and physical training with silent meditation and aerobic exercise to decrease trauma-related and repetitive thoughts, as well as symptoms of depression and anxiety. Woo!
It's a lot.
That's a lot, but very impressive. Thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Before we get going, Tracey, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Originally, I actually lived all over the country and to some extent the world because my dad traveled a lot when I was young. I mean, I was born in Illinois, but I lived in Alabama. I lived in Connecticut. I lived in Belgium. I lived in California. But I've been in New Jersey for like more than 20 years, closer to 30, actually.
Awesome.
So I think I'm almost like a native now.
Yeah, awesome. So look, your bio is crazy and impressive what you do. How did you get to this point? What started this interest in the work you do?
I was always interested in science. My brother's a scientist. And so I had my dad's an engineer. So, I kind of grew up in a very science-oriented family. And then, coupled with that, I was always just interested in people, like why they do what they do. And it's so fascinating. And, back when I went to school, it was a little bit more difficult to merge those two, to merge kind of biology and science with psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And so I majored in both. I majored in biology and psychology. And then at some point I went back to graduate school and majored in what it was then called physiological psychology. I mean, now we would call it behavioral neuroscience. So that's how I got into it.
Okay. So from there, what positions did you take early on in terms of employment?
I was at USC for a long time, at University of Southern California. That's where I got my PhD. And then I actually was really fortunate. I met a really esteemed professor, scientist by the name of Richard Thompson. Just serendipitous. I met him on the way to going to the bathroom actually once. So I always tell my students, go for it, because I saw him. I knew of him. And I was like, should I talk to him? And I was like, yeah, I'm going to talk to him. And so anyway, he eventually offered me a job, a postdoctoral fellowship in his lab. And so that really, kind of catapulted my career because he was super well known.
Wow.
But also, we had similar interests and views on things.
No.
So anyway, I worked for him for a long time. And then I went to Princeton for a while. I worked there for 7 or 8 years. And then I moved to Rutgers.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when and how did your interest blossom in the field of trauma, subject of trauma?
Yeah. When I was working for this person, I started working on stress and how stress affects memory. More at the kind of what we would call like a wet lab, situation. So looking under the microscope or recording from neurons and trying to see like, how does the brain at a cellular level respond to stress and trauma? we would call it stress. These are laboratory studies, obviously. So I did that for a long time. And at some point, like in the 90s, I became interested in looking at female brains. At that time, no one was really looking at female brains. Almost all the laboratory studies were done in male brains.
Interesting.
And, yeah. So they were like,
what was the reason for that?
Well, I mean, they thought that the female brain was just a male brain with some estrogen, kind of thrown in.
Okay.
I mean, which is ironic because it's really the opposite. The default really is the female, and then exposure to testosterone is what differentiates the male and the female brain. But anyway, it was also, I think scientists thought that the estrous cycle, which is like a menstrual cycle, would contribute to variability. It just became the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And so at some point I thought, I'm going to look at female brains. I had heard something unusual about them, and we found a ridiculously interesting, I think, phenomena where if you stress, these are in rodents, these are in rats. So if you stressed a male, they would learn better. And if you stressed a female, they couldn't learn. And so it wasn't just that they were different. They were actually, responding in opposite directions. So I actually investigated that for a long time and found that, it's accompanied by these different responses at the cellular level, at the anatomical level, at the connections between neurons. So and one of the reasons I was so intrigued by this line of research was that we know that women are much more susceptible to stress and trauma-related experiences. They're much more likely to have post-traumatic stress disorder. Women are diagnosed 3 times as much as men with PTSD. They're twice as likely to be diagnosed with depression. They're much more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety. Obviously, eating disorders are super prevalent in women. So, I kind of started thinking, maybe that's part of it. That the brain is just inherently different, and it's responding to these experiences in such a way that they become like vulnerable to these disorders. So
what is it specifically that differentiates or maybe allows the female brain to be more receptive to stress?
God, I wish I knew. I mean, there's so many things, like I think now 20 years later, more than that, actually, now there's a much more work on the differences between the male and female brain. In fact, the National Institute of Health has mandated it so that every experiment now that's done has to have both sexes, unless you have a good reason not to.
Wow.
So now it's like kind of burgeoning out of control. Like there's so many differences that are being documented. So I don't think it's just one thing. And I also want to be careful because it's not necessarily that we're born differently, although we are. There are some changes that are even detectable in utero in humans. So while you're still in the womb. But then our experience also changes our brain, right? How we're treated, how we respond to how we're treated. And so the differences are many, but the causes are as just as many.
Now, let's just kind of take a pause here. And I want to ask you how you define trauma, because we've been using kind of the word stress, and you've been implying, or I think the implication has been that, maybe it's on a continuum, right? And on the far edge of the continuum, we get into trauma. How do you define trauma?
Yeah. My book is entitled Everyday Trauma. So I've actually thought about this a lot. Trauma is the response. Sometimes people think of trauma as the experience or the event, but it really is the response to the event. One way to think of it is it causes damage. The trauma comes from the word wound, which kind of means, there's been a wound. There's been some kind of damage. And so I kind of like that way of thinking about trauma. Stress doesn't have to cause damage necessarily. We have all kinds of stressors in our lives. Even good things are stressful. They cause a stress response in our body. And so it is, to some extent, a continuum. You go from something being moderately or not that stressful to being very stressful. And once it's very stressful, then it starts to get into the trauma, world. Trauma, I think, to some extent, has long-lasting repercussions, more so than stress. Many things that are stressful we kind of forget. Trauma tends to kind of activate those memory systems in our brain more so than a stressor. So, everything that's traumatic is also stressful, but everything that's stressful is not necessarily traumatic.
I mean, there are, as you, I'm sure, are well aware of, there are a lot of different definitions, especially now in our culture. I mean, some people say anything that is disruptive can be traumatizing, whatever. I mean, people can have their own definitions, but the one that I think I'm pretty well familiar with, and it has a certain element to it, and I want to ask you about it, and that is that trauma is an experience that so disrupts our nervous system and it kind of shakes our world in a sense. How does that land for you?
I mean, I think that's a good way of describing it in terms that people can understand. I do, but I also like to think, well, we could find a way to kind of describe it more mechanistically. Like, what is it? What is that threshold when something becomes destabilizing to the point where it's, you become dysfunctional? I mean, in my book, it's entitled Everyday Trauma, and I do go into some detail about how to think about that word. We often think of trauma experiences as these big events. You have this big event. It's an earthquake, it's a rape, it's a violent attack, something like that. And then you have these repercussions, and those can go on day after day. So that's in a way an everyday trauma, right? The event itself is acute and short, but the repercussions in our memories and our feelings and our emotions, those are maybe every day we think about it. And then there's other traumas that really do last every day or conceivably every day. Discrimination, poverty, homelessness, chronic illness, taking care of someone who's chronically ill. Those are also everyday traumas. So I don't think there's, one really clear definition. I also agree with, some experts in the field who say we can't call everything trauma, just because we don't like it or just because it bothers us. It's not necessarily traumatic. So I agree with that. But it's very personal. You ask somebody and someone can have almost what seems like the same experience. And one person's like, no big deal. And another person's like, wow, I have never gotten over that.
Right. Let me just pause here for a minute. We're speaking with Dr. Tracey Shores. We're going to be talking about her book, Everyday Trauma, Remapping the Brain's Response to Stress, Anxiety, and Painful Memories for a Better Life. Let's pause here to thank our sponsors. All right. So talking about this book here, why did you write the book?
Why did I write the book? I'll tell you, as I mentioned, I had a laboratory for many years, successful laboratory, did a lot of, I think, important things. And, at some point I was like, wow, I just can't keep all this information to myself, or my peers. It's just, I feel like people should know more about how the brain actually works. We have lots of interventions and therapies and what have you, but, I'm always surprised how little people know about their own brain. I mean, it's our brain. It makes us who we are. It makes us everything. It's our memories. It's how we feel. It's how we think. It's how we stay alive. So, part of it was just like, I just wanted people to know more about the brain. I also wanted to emphasize the difference between the female and male brain. I feel like maybe people didn't appreciate the differences that really exist. One of my big interests now is sexual violence. Well, interest is a good word for it, but I'm just distressed by it. But there's so much sexual violence, and so another reason I kind of started going down this road was to talk more about how sexual violence affects women and to help them overcome it. So
How did you structure the book? Let's talk a little bit about, because one of the things I want to get to is you mentioned this aspect of repetitive thought, repetitive memories, and so forth. So let's kind of get there, but give us a broad scope of how you structured the book and why you did it that way.
Yeah. I mean, it's really three parts. So the first part is more what I would call psychology, kind of basic psychology. What is stress? What is trauma? What are the various types of experiences we could have? And what are the various outcomes? What kind of mental illnesses are associated with stress? What are the symptoms of those? Kind of like a general overview of that world. And then the middle part is more neuroscientific, I would say. I get into a little bit more about how memories are made in the brain, traumatic memories, but just memories in general. And I do talk quite a bit about neurogenesis. One of the things that I was involved with early on was the production of new neurons in the brain, the discovery that the brain continues to make new neurons. And so I do talk a lot about these new neurons and how we can make more of them and keep them alive, through learning. And so it's kind of more about the cellular aspects of stress and trauma. Neurogenesis is also very much affected by stress and trauma. So people that are stressed or have PTSD or depressed, they make, well, we don't know for sure if they make fewer of these cells, but certainly the place where these cells are made is smaller, the hippocampus, which is where they're made. So I kind of just describe kind of the basics. I don't think it's too technical, but it's, got a little more detail. And then the last part is more about recovery from trauma. One of the things that I've also been doing over the last decade or so is developing this intervention. I call it MAP Train My Brain. And MAP stands for mental and physical. And I really developed it based on this work on neurogenesis, because, we had discovered that these neurons are made in the brain throughout your life. Most people we didn't even know that we continued to make neurons in adulthood. So once they were discovered, people wanted to know, what are they doing? Why do we have these new neurons? And it turns out they're involved in memory, in learning new things. And one of the more amazing things I think about these cells is that many of them die unless you learn something new. So it's kind of a use it or lose it. You're making these cells, and then if you learn something new, they stay alive. And then they become incorporated into the rest of your brain. But the learning has to be effortful. It has to be something that you really concentrate on, something you really put, your kind of your heart and soul, so to speak, into. You're really paying attention. And then another lab in California had shown that you could make more of these cells with exercise, with aerobic exercise. So I had this idea, well, what if we combine those two, make more cells through aerobic exercise and then keep them alive through some kind of mental training. And Now, the mental training is meditation, the exercise is aerobic exercise.
Okay. I'm going to ask what I think feels like a stupid question, but what's the purpose of doing this? What's the purpose of creating? Well, what's the purpose of the neurogenesis? What's the purpose of creating these new neurons?
Oh, what's the purpose?
I can understand the purpose of learning new stuff, but obviously that learning new stuff creates new neurons. How does that benefit us?
Well, it's always good to have more new neurons. Seriously. There's no situation. There might be a few very rare, unusual circumstances where you would make neurons that you don't want. But in general, you want more neurons in your brain. They make connections to other neurons. They're just, it's like saying, like, do you want more blood cells? Yeah, you want more blood cells, so they're just basic building blocks of our brain. But, since we did those early studies, there's lots more information on them now. And they do seem to be really important for maintaining a functioning brain, memory systems, for being healthy, for being able to concentrate, just things that we maybe take for granted. But if you really think about it, you have to have a substrate for this behaviors. You have to have something that does it. Mm-hmm. And these neurons are part of that system.
So talk a little bit about what happens to the brain when someone experiences trauma.
Well, there's so many things, during the traumatic experience itself, there's a big stress response. The sympathetic nervous system, where your heart beats really fast and you release lots of epinephrine into the bloodstream and neurotransmitters into the brain. I mean, there's hardly anything that doesn't, well, I shouldn't say that, but there's not much that doesn't change when you are under a lot of stress in the brain. Like if you put an electrode down into the brain during a stressful experience, the cells are firing more, neurotransmitters are being released, hormones are being released, which is changing all kinds of, systems in the brain. So it's a big experience. And, that's partly why we remember it so well, because it's changed so many, systems that we depend upon.
A lot of people listening to this are therapists of all kinds, people in the mental health space, survivors, a combination of the two. What do you feel is important that they know about your book? What's kind of that take home couple of things?
Yeah, I think one of the things is that I don't think it's too technical. I think there's accessible information in there that could help. One of the things that you kind of mentioned is I talk a lot about ruminations. Ruminations are these repetitive thoughts that all of us have. Women are particularly prone to ruminations. They're usually negative. They're always autobiographical. So they're about yourself. And they're usually associated with blame or regret. I like to think of them as memories laced with mood, right? Because they are a form of memory since you repeat them, but they have this kind of mood attached to them. And they're really detrimental, actually, because when you're ruminating, you're not thinking about other things that might be important. That you've gotten all the information out of that thought, but you keep going back to it. And that's what to ruminate means, like to chew on something, like a cow chewing on the cud, and the nutrients are gone and you're still chewing. So it's a good analogy for rumination. But the other thing that I think that's interesting to know about these thoughts is that anytime you have a memory or bring back a memory, so to speak, you create another memory, right? Because that memory that you brought to this present moment now becomes associated with this moment. Mm-hmm. So if I bring back a memory of, my uncle, right now, I've made another memory of my uncle here with you. And that's a benign example, but you can imagine if you're always bringing back these negative memories, you're making more of these traces in your brain. So ruminations, they're distressing, they're distracting, et cetera, but they're also changing the brain. And, one of the things that we have been giving this intervention that I have, this Map Train My Brain intervention out in the world to many people, mostly women with trauma. And one of the outcomes that we see in every single study that we've done is fewer ruminations. So people say, oh, I don't ruminate as much anymore. And then, when you don't ruminate as much anymore, then that's associated with less depression, less anxiety, fewer traumatic thoughts. We just actually finished a study with women who had sexual violence. Everyone had PTSD. All the women had PTSD when we started. And they went through this program twice a week for 6 weeks. It's just 1 hour.
Map Train My Brain?
Map Train My Brain. it's 30 minutes of meditation followed by 30 minutes of aerobic exercise. They also learn a little bit about the brain along the way. And afterwards, the women had 40% fewer symptoms of PTSD, according to DSM criteria. So that's a lot, 40%.
Right, 40%, huge.
Yeah, that's a lot. More than half were no longer met criteria for PTSD. And they were ruminating a lot less. So I think sometimes, we look for like these really complicated answers or even interventions to help people. And sometimes a little knowledge, coupled with this is obviously some mental training, coupled with some exercise, aerobic exercise, getting the heart rate up. I don't know. I mean, I don't even know exactly why it works so well, but it does work.
Well, that's very interesting. Yes. And you mentioned interventions. I mean, as you know, there are a slew of interventions out there, modalities out there. What are your thoughts on all of these interventions and modalities?
Yeah. I mean, if you really break it down, they're probably not that different from each other. And some of these things have been going on for, thousands of years. People have been using these tools to help themselves. I mean, I guess, generally my philosophy, and I somewhat talk about this in my book, and particularly at the end, is like, get as many tools as you can. Like everything's not going to be tailor-made to each person, and there's not going to be one intervention that's going to help everyone. Right. So, pick up these tools, learn new skills. It's really the skills, it's not so much the intervention that's helping, because even for the people that we help, we'll ask them later, are you still doing it? Sometimes they're not, but they still learn these skills. So when something bad happens, they're like, yeah, I know that I should probably, sit in silence and count my breaths for 10 minutes and I'll feel better, or, go for a run. And, they capture these like little skills that they can use throughout their life. And I think that's true. Yeah. I mean, I feel like let me just say one more thing about this. The brain loves to learn new things. It loves novelty. It really responds to novelty. So, that's the key. Like, get out there, learn new skills, expose yourself to new opportunities for learning. That's kind of my philosophy.
As we kind of wind down here, I appreciate you saying, when you're talking about the results of that, those women going through MAP, you're like, I'm not even sure why it works. I mean, I appreciate your honesty, but give us something. I mean, it's this mental meditation and physical. It seems like we all can do that, right? It's not some wild
it isn't
intervention or modality, but take a shot. What is working there?
Yeah, I mean, I have theories out the kazoo, but okay. So one of my theories, of course, relates to neurogenesis, that it's helping create and increasing survival of these neurons in the brain. But that's almost untestable. I do think one reason it might work is because when people are sitting in meditation, this is silent sitting meditation. It's hard, right? People don't often like to do guided meditation. So this is silent sitting meditation, and then followed by slow walking meditation. The heart rate's super low. It's a very much a parasympathetic nervous system state. And so the brain is learning, conceivably, that when thoughts come up, traumatic thoughts, stressful thoughts, distressing memories, that, oh, wait, just because I had that thought, my body is not racing. My heart is not racing. I'm not anxious. So you learn that. And then immediately after that, you go into this aerobic exercise state, which is sympathetic. The heart is going fast, over 100 beats per minute. So, but it's not full of fear. Usually when you're afraid, your heart is racing, you associate that fearful experience with this feeling in your body. But in this case, particularly in my online course, we have music. We're kind of like doing routines to the music. It's fun. People generally think it's pretty fun. So again, you're kind of learning, oh, just because I have this, my heart is racing, I'm not necessarily afraid. And, you might say, well, that sounds kind of simplistic, but that's how we learn. We're learning to really associate what's happening in our body with our experience, like how we feel. And the brain has to be trained. It can't just pick this stuff up, necessarily from a book or something. Sometimes you really have to get on there and just train the brain.
Right. Which is, I think what, I don't want to say a lot, but maybe several trauma treatment modalities do, right? Inviting the client to be in the moment, to be self-aware, to be having those memories, and to know that they're safe in a sense. Why did you choose aerobic activity? Why not just walking or anaerobic activity or weight training?
Well, aerobic activity is the absolute best medicine for the brain. Like the brain uses like 20% of the oxygen that we breathe in is used by the brain. So the brain needs lots of oxygen. And the best way to get oxygen is through exercise, because when the heart beats fast, that blood goes right up your carotid arteries to your brain. So yeah, it's, so if you want to consolidate memory or enhance brain structures, it's aerobic. It's got to be aerobic exercise. And it also increases neurogenesis, as I mentioned, increases blood flow, blood structures. It's just, it's just a very powerful stimulus for the brain.
The name of the book is Everyday Trauma, Remapping the Brain's Response to Stress, Anxiety, and Painful Memories for a Better Life. Dr. Tracey Shores, phenomenal. I mean, so inspiring. Love to have you back. I mean, there's so much to talk about. I mean, we didn't even touch your interest in sexual assault and violence against women. That's a whole different podcast. But thank you so much for being here. I mean, you're incredible.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I had so much fun, and I'm just happy to get the message out any way I can.
All right. Best way for people to get in contact with you is what?
You can contact me at maptrainmybrain@gmail.com. That's my Gmail. And I also have a website, maptrainmybrain.com. And I even have a course I'm just uploading this week. So if someone's interested in taking it online, you can do it. And even if you don't want to take my course, you can read about it on the website.
Okay. We'll have all those linked up here at the show notes page at thetraumatherapistpodcast.com. Thank you so much. Great meeting you.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.